first thing I got was this call from his manager saying, send him your pages. And I was like, I don't have any pages. What are you talking about? But I generated some pages. And we just sent them back and forth. And then finally we had a full script, and we would send the full script back and forth. And we really talked almost not at all. So I would just ask him, what are the parameters of the work you want on this script? And he could say, I just want to polish, or do whatever you want. And I would just do whatever I wanted. And, you know, we didn't really have to talk, because I would know, like, if he kept my scene, he liked it. And if he cut it, he didn't like it. So it felt like actually pretty clear communication, but we talked on the phone almost not at all.
Have you worked with a director like that before?
No, I really hadn't. I'm working with a director now, but no, I think that was my first experience of that. I worked a little bit with our director on Divergent, but and I worked a little bit with David Frankel on Hope Springs, but not in such a direct way from the very beginning as, you know, sort of co-writers.
How long did it take you guys to finish the screenplay from like start to finish?
Well, my work on the screenplay was about 6 months. And then I think Guillermo continued to sort of tweak it and work on it as he approached production and into production, you know, as often happens.
Did you have any involvement on set after you finished with the screenplay?
Nothing whatsoever. Like, it was the same. I like never heard from him again. I was like, I don't know what's gonna happen. Maybe this will get made. And then it was shooting, and then I saw a very early cut. He invited me to see an early cut of the movie. And then, you know, then I sort of started seeing it. I saw it again at Toronto Film Festival and stuff like that. But yeah, the first time I met any of our actors was at Toronto Film Festival. So that was kind of crazy.
That is, and I'm sure you guys will be talking more, considering that you're nominated for a Golden Globe.
Yeah, you do see people at these events. If you're shy, it can be really challenging, but fortunately all of our actors are just incredibly nice people and very friendly, so that is a lucky break.
So since you've written for Game of Thrones, the Divergent series, even Alias, all these programs that have genre elements to them, like The Shape of Water, what do you think it is about, and with like Guillermo's work, like fairy tales and monster movies that lets them be able to tell stories about the worlds that we're in, that a more traditional film that, say, didn't have a monster in it could say?
You know, I think there's lots of different ways to tell stories that are relevant, but I think when you're dealing with fantasy elements and fairy tale elements, sometimes you're able to do things in a way that is sort of more elegant and feels more sort of lyrical and metaphorical, and not so much hitting somebody over the head with it. So I think that's sort of the beauty of this type of movie, is that you can talk about things that are happening today and you never have to actually mention them.
What is it about this story that drew you to it, that made you want to work with Guillermo on it?
You know, I really, from the very beginning, when he told me the story, I understood what the story was, and I understood why he loved it. And I also understood, for me, something that's really important with a screenplay is tone. What does it sort of sound and feel like? And am I capable of generating that? And when he told me about it, he made some references to things he liked or was inspired by. And at one point we talked about the Coen brothers, and I love the Coen brothers, but I also just felt like, I kind of understand the tone he's mentioning. And I felt like it was something where I love this, but I also could see adding value or being helpful. And so together that was like, great, I love it. And, you know, truthfully, Guillermo is kind of unique, or at least very unusual, in that he doesn't seem preoccupied at all with the business of Hollywood and the things that are kind of icky about it. He's almost entirely this pure sort of creative, artistic spirit. And to work with someone like that is such a joy. You just don't get that opportunity every day.
So what are some of the little flourishes that you could say were your own in this film?
Guillermo likes to say that he did all the romantic stuff and I did things about spies, which I think is sort of true. I don't have a lot of flourishes. What I would say is that I tried to help with structure and to make sure that the story made sense, flowed, and had momentum, and was coherent.
Okay, that's very important to have. So I'd like to open it up to the audience. If anybody would like to ask a question, we have the microphone right here, so don't be shy and come on up. Anybody would like to ask a question? I think the audience is shy.
That's okay. I'm shy too. Don't worry about it. No worries. It was
Actually, someone says they're still just paralyzed from the great film that they saw, but we actually have a question coming up. Go ahead. Yeah, just speak into the.
So just a quick question, because it seemed like music played a big part in how Eliza communicated her feelings and how she felt. Was that in any part in the script, like the specific songs or things like that?
Sorry, could you repeat that? That was a little quiet.
It seemed like music played a big part in how Eliza communicated her feelings and how she felt. Was that in like specific songs? Were they in the script at all, or was it just like?
Oh yeah, I mean Guillermo had been thinking about that and really had some very specific stuff in mind. You'll note that even though it's set in 1962, a lot of the references are from the 40s. And he absolutely, like tonally and visually, from the very beginning, he knew exactly what he wanted out of that stuff. So yeah, we went back and forth with that stuff, but I saw everything was sort of in there already.
Awesome, thank you. And also thank you for everything that you did. Like, it was an absolutely incredible movie. I wanted to actually ask, what came into the decision to, you know, like the fish creature was able to heal people and heal, you know, heal wounds, heal, like, you know, give back his hair. What was the decision to keep the main character mute? You know, why did they heal, you know, the vocal cords and such?
Oh, that's so interesting. I hadn't thought of it in those terms, in terms of him being able to heal it. But I would defer to Guillermo, of course, if he may have a different opinion. But from my perspective, the fact that she can't speak is not a disability. Like, it characterizes her in the way that he can't speak either. And I think it was meant to be a parallel, right? She has those things on her neck which turn out to be sort of gills and speak to the fact that they are in some way the same. So I don't think it was meant to be like a deficit that she would want healed, but rather sort of this mystical thing that we would later find out is sort of an asset when she ends up, you know, being under the water. And to me, you know, and we discussed very, very briefly what if she could talk, but to me it was always the beauty of the two protagonists not saying anything, but being the people who had all the emotional connection in the film in the midst of all these other people who talk and talk and talk and talk and really ultimately are not saying very much.
So on that note, did it present any challenges writing a character who couldn't necessarily speak the dialogue that you were writing for her the way that another character might?
You know, I didn't really feel it did. Early on, someone said to me, like, that's impossible. How are you going to write a love story with people who can't talk? And I was like, what are you talking about? This is the greatest part of this whole thing. Obviously, at some point, you know, Guillermo had her friend translating for her. So at a certain point, if you want to hear what she has to say, you have to do that. And throughout the film, of course, people are translating for her. But I felt like for the most part, you pretty much get it without it. And I was very familiar with Sally's work, the actress, and I knew she could impart anything we needed and probably better without words than if we clogged it up with dialogue. So I really never felt particularly nervous about that.
Hello.
Hello? Hi.
I don't know if this is something that you would be able to answer because it seems you were more on the writing structure, script side of it. But when you watch the movie, and with most of Guillermo's movies, you get enriched in this whole society that he kind of creates in this whole world.
Right.
So this is obviously like very Art Deco, and it reminds me, and this is very nerdy, but it reminds me of a game called BioShock that had a lot of these, it had a lot of these structures, and so especially in the beginning of the movie, I couldn't help but think, this is like a Rapture, which is a town in the game. Was that anything people were aware of, or do you think it was happenstance?
Well, I certainly didn't hear about that from Guillermo, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't an influence. As you know, he's very well versed in the game world. And so, you'd have to ask him. But yeah, it wasn't something that we ever talked about, but I'm certain that it's possible.
Hi, I just want to start by saying this is probably the most amazing film I've seen in forever. And
Thanks.
I just want to thank you for your contribution to it. So my question is about the theme of othering in the film.
Mm-hmm.
In college, I studied, I took a class about monstrosity and how monstrosity in literature comes with the theme of othering to a very common extent. And so what I really appreciated about this film is that it seemed to be, throughout the film in so many different ways, from Giles and his struggle being, a homosexual man in a society that did not necessarily tolerate that, or
Right.
Zelda being a very emblematic, African-American woman character at this time in American history, with her home situation.
Right.
And, I just appreciated that so much. I felt it was so well done.
Oh, thank you.
And what I want to ask is, what sort of, not necessarily tropes, but what sort of, literature did you draw inspiration for these characters from? Giles and Zelda.
Well, truthfully, first of all, this is all Guillermo. And Guillermo, we're sort of fortunate that this film seems to have some relevance right now because of what's going on in our political situation. But the truth of it is, Guillermo, as an immigrant, I think thinks about the things you're talking about all the time. And so he was not exactly responding to what's going on in culture so much as writing and thinking about what's on his mind all the time about these questions of the other. And so, I mean, truthfully, I simply responded to where I thought he was going. So I didn't have to call on those types of tropes in the sense that he was already indicating to me sort of who these people were. And there was a little bit of give and take in terms of how far to push certain characters in one direction or another. But I really didn't have to originate them because he had sort of arrived with this group of people. And I would say the Strickland character had the most sort of change over the course of the development of the script because he had at one point been sort of somewhat darker and less, reading The Power of Positive Thinking or whatever. But Guillermo really had pretty full ideas of who populated this world. It was just a question of what the scenes were and how the screenplay was really going to work.
So first off, thanks for making us all cry. Yeah. There were well-earned tears, but I don't think there was a dry eye in the house. Myself included. It was just a speck of dust. In terms of structure, when you go into a process like this, what is there like considerations like, okay, page 30, the inciting incident has to happen, or that sort of thing was just intuitive with you?
Well, so normally, of course, you think about those things. And I think it does become intuitive after you've been doing this for a period of time that you sort of feel the absence of those things if they're not there. But I was very conscious of the fact that Guillermo had a little bit more of he wanted it to be somewhat less formulaic, and he had certain things he wanted that wouldn't necessarily, get past all the Hollywood studio executives. And so I was very conscious of not wanting to be that type of influence on the movie. I wanted to help him to make it coherent, to make it suspenseful, but I didn't want to try to shift it into something more conventional than what he wanted to do. And so I was very conscious the whole time of whether we were going that way or not going that way. But I wasn't purposefully trying to impose those types of things on the script because I thought it would be wrong to sort of interfere with his vision for it that way, and I wasn't certain that it was necessary.
Hi. So earlier you were asked about little flourishes that showed up that were a bit of your creations. What I wanted to know was I'm curious about some of the moments that maybe